Well, hi. Welcome to the fourth episode of What is Truth with Reverend David William Parry. And I am thoroughly enjoying myself, and it seems as though we have people that are interested in following the conversation, so that's a good thing. I think that that's a difficult subject, and that's why I picked it. And David was asking me before, about the subject. Are we going to depart from the subject? So David, do you want to depart from truth?
Never, never. Especially truth with a capital T, because it never ever loses its relevancy. And look what happens amongst those people that think it does. And of course, speaking of tea, as I was saying to you a minute ago off air, I do recognise your gags every week about Americans drinking coffee and the British drinking tea. So I don't have tea in this cup. I don't have tea in this cup because I need a coffee. I need a coffee in a minute. So, but at the moment, no, I'm luxuriating in the thirst for finding knowledge about truth and having a very nice day indeed. Always a pleasure to be working with you, John.
Well, we've explored some interesting avenues, and because of where you are in London, I started proceeding along Londinium lines. And that's a fascinating thing because here in America, Londinium has played such a big role. And so that really is an important thread to the perception of truth. And when you get into which is basically, as you know, my central focus, the work of Dr. Rudolf Steiner and spiritual science, he makes some interesting comments regarding the power of truth and the way in which things that one creates have a greater longevity if they embody truth. And so consequently, you look at some enduring institutions, for example, the example I gave on the show before. In fact, at this point, I don't even remember if it was a show with you or somebody else, but I'll make the point again because it's relevant. If you look at the longevity of the Catholic Church, although it's kind of hobbling along at the current time with its attempt to work within this socio-economic political scene so heavily as of late. But nonetheless, if you look at the founding of the Catholic Church and the structure of the Catholic Church specifically, going back to Pseudo-Dionysius, as he's called by many scholars, but the traditions of Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the first bishop of Athens. He was brought into the fold by St. Paul. And really, that's quite an impressive task, because the position of Dionysius in Athens at that time was extremely important, being that he was one of the principal teachers in the Agora, in the hill of the Agora, and where the Agora is like the marketplace. And Agora, it goes back to an old Sanskrit root. It's interesting, as do your Sanskrit rooted languages, but Agora, a place without darkness. So that's interesting. Well, in India, you have the Agoris, so that they're even willing to go into the darkness. But that's too obscure for our current conversation. But nonetheless, we've been exploring some of the interesting circle that tend to get together in Oxford on Thursday nights at a cozy little pub near Oxford, and it included J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Owen Barfield, and Dyson, and Charles Williams, and all these people, almost to the man, were authors, and also just quite a cast of characters rotating, not showing up every week and all of that. But they would get into discussions, and somebody once asked J.R.R. Tolkien, who his background was in early like Anglo-Saxon languages, and he was a linguistic scholar for the rude languages of the English language, and Chaucer, and so much that it is interesting because he's so different. He was Roman Catholic, and then you have C.S. Lewis became Anglican, and Owen Barfield was into Rudolf Steiner like myself, and there's a whole group. Charles Williams was a member of Hermetic Society, and so it's very, very diverse. And so they happened to ask Tolkien. I don't remember who asked him, but they said, "How is it you guys can get together?" And he named off their backgrounds, as I just did, and discuss things like religion. And Tolkien said, "It's not important that we agree as to what the answers are, but that we agree as to what the important questions are." And so consequently, that's kind of my take on Christianity. America, as you probably know, is quite diverse when it comes to its denominations. And according to the official registry, there's more than 35,000 denominations of Christianity in the United States, which is like, if you had a convention, that'd be pretty intense, and it would be interesting to see how and if they even got along. But at this stage of the game, I think it's more important than ever for the various Christian denominations to strive to come into community with other Christians, and the whole idea of having church, and which we're not allowed to in some places in the U.S. right now to go to church because it's a threat, but yet they could allow people to have demonstrations, and that's not a threat. So we know that's just some political construct they're working with. But nonetheless, it's challenging many Christians and Jews and Muslims, everybody is like, do they really have that power to do that? And the real answer, according to the Constitution, is only if you give it to them. And so just yesterday, I was all morning on the phone talking to my friend Christopher Strunk, and he was filing suit in New York regarding the very thing. He had some interesting takes on it. Perhaps we'll get to that in more detail some other time. But nonetheless, freedom of religion is right at the head of the list, and so consequently, I don't know what to say, but if was any time to be open about your convictions, I think now is the time. I think that there's a great many what you might call closet Christians in the U.S. People that are very quiet about it, unassuming, but they have a inward faith in God or in Jesus Christ, but they don't so much wear it on their sleeve. So then there's all those others. So you could call them all denominations. So then you would say there has to be at least several million denominations of Christianity in the United States. And so that's fine with me. What that brings to mind is the comments that Rudolf Steiner said. He said one of the great uh, things about Christianity that shows its depth is that it could be approached on any level. So you have some of the most profound scholars dealing with its content, and yet it's able to give a narrative to stir the convictions of the simplest souls. So that to me is a beautiful thing. And so on that, I'm gonna pass off to you, and I'm sure that I stirred up a few things.
Oh, you have this amazing, eloquent habit of firing this storm in my brain. So there are a billion things I want to say back. I used to meet chums of mine in the Eagle and Child in Oxford. Every week, a friend of mine who went on to be Richard Rudgley, who went on to be a broadcaster and quite well-known anthropologist. I used to have lunch with him every month or so at St Cross College, Oxford. So the Eagle and Child I know quite well. I think that's one of the hostelries, as they say in this part of the world, where that eminent crew of inebriates used to meet. And what a wonderful location! What a wonderful location! I mean, in terms of truth, I mean, gosh, everyone has me down. I mean, you're the cultural historian. I mean, I can't compete with that. I mean, curiously, everyone has me down as this sort of antique antiquarian, but I'm not. I'm actually quite a modernist. I probably don't look like it, but I am. So the obsession, the guy I keep coming back to, even though Rudolf Steiner is this, unmitigated treasure in Western culture, and he really needs a lot more study, a lot more. The sort of material he's coming up with, he's no, I'll go into a eulogy if I'm not careful. The Goethe-inspired material. I mean, absolutely astonishing. But with me, I always tend to fall back into default around Kierkegaard somewhere. I go into these reveries about Hegel, the most intelligent Lutheran that's ever existed, of course. And it's all wonderful and it's all uplifting, but I always get back to that sort of solid Scandinavian root. And with me, it's always Kierkegaard and sort of the aphorism, subjectivity is truth, truth is subjectivity, which is an overwhelmingly powerful thing to say the minute you start to unpack that. The minute you unfold it like the slices of an orange, the minute you peel that and get all the different segments and start tasting them, innumerable unexpected flavors from different parts of the orange. So with me, I always tend to gravitate back there. A billion years ago, when I was finishing a doctorate, I never actually finished it. I was given an honorary doctorate, but I never actually finished it. And I suppose I'm fishing for others, but that's another story. I was actually thinking of doing Kierkegaard as a scholar. I was going to base it on his views on friendship, and I always felt C.S. Lewis didn't actually go far enough with friendship. And it's one of the few books that falls down for me. John, I give the wand back to you.
Well, it's interesting you say that you didn't finish your doctorate, but you got an honorary doctorate. And see, what people don't realize, honorary doctorates are more rarefied than doctorates. There's fewer people that have honoraries. So it's quite a thing to be noticed, to the point to where they decide to give you an honorarium like that. So back to you. I just thought that was an interesting.
Oh no, it's very kind. I mean, I always end up being apologetic for the whole thing. I'm not entirely sure why. But there we are. No, thank you, John. Thank you. In terms of Christian denominations, I mean, I started out with an American denomination. I'm one of those people, curiously, and as a pastor, I suppose is particularly curious, that finds organized religion very uncomfortable. I can see what spiritual people are doing, and I normally prefer that company. What religious people are doing normally tends to have me in very uneasy territories. I hope that's not true of any of the churches I've worked with. And people mustn't get me wrong. I've met some absolutely extraordinary and wonderful people within mainstream Christian denominations. But I actually started out when I was thinking, well, I think I've got a vocation. I'm sensing I've got a vocation. I believe I'm being told I've got a vocation with the Metropolitan Community Church, which, of course, is an LGBTQ friendly denomination. It was started in America by Troy Perry. And it was after that, the journey, despite sort of Anglican and Roman Catholic roots in the family, that I started exploring. But at the moment, I mean, I'm only mentioning that because at the moment I'm gravitating back towards Metropolitan Community Church. And for all sorts of reasons. It's modern. It's interested in a social gospel. It wants to discuss the future. And I know that's on your mind a lot, and that's on my mind a lot. We can't just react to the past all the time. We've got, what is coming up? What's coming next? It's vital that spiritual and religious people start thinking about these things. What does the present iconoclasm mean? Is it uniformly bad that all these things are being destroyed? The answer for me is yes and no. I mean, there's a whole mare's nest we can get into. But, and truth coming from a sort of Kierkegaardian existentialist angle, I think is incredibly telling. Because I noticed none of them actually really want, unlike the postmodernists, and I love a bit of Pomo. I love a bit of Pomo in the arts. But the minute they start pontificating over meta questions, over metaphysical questions, like, is there a truth with a capital T? Is there a goodness with a capital G? I must admit, it always rings rather hollow to me. They tend to be very, very good at starting a fight, but they tend to be very, very bad at finishing it. So I end up at the, I get to the last page of a book and I go, oh my God, what was all that about? Although having said that, right, since Leo is not on this show, I could confess even further that I've got very good friends in the Jesuits. I don't know what you think about them, John, but I can only speak of one who's a true friend of mine, the Reverend Dr. Robert McTeague of the Society of Jesus, who, of course, was one of the students of Paul Weiss, who was an agnostic Jew and practically the demigod of aesthetics in the 80s. An American gentleman. Robert said to me once, it was a bit like learning philosophy from a Jewish butcher. He'd give you something, but only grudgingly, and then he'd want to take it back anyway. So, I've always been in awe of American input into these matters. My one worry is when ideas never actually take root, like ideas, European ideas taking root, even in friendly soil like America. God knows what happens to them the minute they're outside the Anglophone sphere. I mean, what happens to these ideas when they're in Moscow? What happens to these ideas when they're in Delhi or Beijing? Because I think they take on strangely a very different complexion. And recovering what they meant, even in friendly soil, is difficult. So I struggle with American input, even though I hope and I think I'm on safe ground with that. And, and that's mutual, I think. What is truth? What is truth? For me, the existentialists pursue it very well. Paul Weiss pursued it eminently in a book called The God We Seek. Robert McTeague is bringing out his first book of philosophy, since primarily he's a philosopher. This fall, as you all say in America, tools for philosophy. I'll get him to send you a copy. And, you end up with this. Tell you what I love about American culture, apart from the Constitution. I'm a Constitution worshipper, as you know. I love the pragmatism, and I love the imagination, and I love the fact it will grapple with the nitty-gritty that is so necessary nowadays. The bit that worries me is when Europeans say highfalutin things that are really aimed at other Europeans, and they're lost in translation, even though it's the same language. I don't know what you think about any of that, John.
Well, I mean, if you look at American Christian or Judeo-Christian culture as a whole, I continually bring it back to the Revolutionary period and the founding fathers, because if there is such a thing as an America, meaning the United States of America. I know Canadians get annoyed when you say, well, we live in America too, you know. Say, the Mexicans, they don't get into that too much. But then, you know, I haven't been down there in a while. But it never came up. And so, but consequently, that would be a trifling matter at the border when they'd ask you your citizenship and you say American, and they get their border guard, Canadian border guys would get upset with that because you're supposed to say United States. And so it's interesting, this whole concept of identity. What do we identify with? What little box do you live in? You know, what is your, what are the limits of your capacities to be able to come into relationship of the experience of truth for other people? And that's something that I've spent my life trying to pursue, because as you know, I ran the world's largest metaphysical, holistic bookstore in the world for all the years back before the internet. And I consequently had the opportunity to meet all manner of various denominations and different religions and gurus and spiritual teachers and New Age movement figureheads and holistic health professionals and healers, and you name it. I mean, you know, Zoroastrian people that worked with light healing. I had one of those units, you know, from Dinshaw P. Gedalia, the chrometry encyclopedia system of healing with colored light. And so I have always allowed things to be able to get to me. I always tried to understand things. I didn't have a lot of respect when somebody dismissed something that they didn't understand. And that's a difficult thing for me. And I could understand just to say you don't have the time. Okay, that's fine. But to offhandedly dismiss its value because you've never spent the time and it's just they're not on your team. That's kind of an interesting canard of sorts. Not to be disrespectful to people of the canard denomination, but ultimately, I think that for me, again, the great inspiration within the Inklings over at the Eagle and Child pub near Oxford in those Thursday night meetings was Owen Barfield, and who was an editor for a time at Faber and Faber, which is a very interesting publishing firm that published actually the Philocalian Fathers of the Eastern Orthodox Church in English, and they also did what they published the books on flower essences, and just, you know, very, very interesting character, Owen Barfield, and his history in English words. You know, he had stumbled upon the concept of the evolution of consciousness from his study of language. And being that he was trained as a barrister and practiced at the bar, you know, law, that was the formal career he had for long periods of time. It's all about language. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. Even getting beyond the normative standard into what is called legalese, where they have their own language and they can tell you something that sounds like it's perfectly clear. And you say, well, does that mean? And then they say, well, no. Because it has a meaning based on precedent. And so England, the UK, they don't have a constitution. They have piles and piles and piles of precedents from the courts. In fact, there's many of the documents of the bar were edited by a distant relative of mine. But nonetheless, getting into understanding what all this means, if on the American side of things, more people had the King James translation of the Bible in their homes in continental America than any other book. It was most homes, log cabins, what have you, would have at the most 3 to 5 books, one of which was almost unvaryingly the King James Bible, and people learned to speak the language reading scripture. And that's something that's really to be taken into account, because the American system of government is to a large extent based on the Old Testament Judaism system of government, but with also factors that were brought in by William Penn from the Cherokee Nation and different Indian confederations. It was an interesting a conversation a group of us had with David Spangler from Findhorn, and he was talking about the Indians, the Cherokee Nation, and he talked about how they would meet in a circle around a fire, and each one of them, the men would meet, and there would be one person who was the tender of the fire, and he didn't say anything. He was a silent witness of what went on, and they would discuss things, and then when they came up with a solution, they would go out and they would present it to the grandmothers. And then the grandmothers would either say yes or no. And if it was no, they'd go back to the fire tent, they'd sit down and they'd hammer it out and keep going back and forth until they came up with something that the grandmothers would agree with, which I think is an interesting point. We really don't have that here, but there's a perspective in that has a certain wisdom, because again, this isn't the presenting the what they came up with to the newly married brides. That's not who it was, to the grandmothers, and so it's that wisdom element. And it's interesting because Rudolf Steiner had made the point at one time. He said, "It's not Christ that they lack. It's the Sophia of Christ, the wisdom that they lack." And so consequently, you get into trying to understand what that means, because with Rudolf Steiner, it's never simple. And that's the beauty, is that it's, for something to have a spiritual content, it has to have a certain riddle involved in it, so that it becomes participation in delving into what's being presented. And that's, to a large extent, what's so wonderful about Scripture, is that you read it and you don't understand it. If you understand it all right away, then you're limiting your perspectives too much. And one of the challenges when people get so literal that it becomes like a cage. You live in this cage. Well, no, I can't call your phone number because it's not in the Old Testament or the New Testament. It's like, you're not in on it. And it's clear from the Pauline dispensation that Christ came for all men. And it's also clear from the Gospel of John when he says God is love. And he mentions love 17 times. So that there's definitely a central thrust regarding that whole concept, because say, well, what is truth? And that can turn into an abstraction, which really doesn't help the conversation, just going off into abstractions. But more important than being smart is being clear, is something the Dalai Lama said to me and my friends many years ago when we met him. We were among the first people to meet him when he came to America, to Ann Arbor. And so there's this commonality of truth, and it's truth that will set you free, as the saying goes, but it's also truth that allows genuine communication to happen with people. And Rudolf Steiner made the point in a lecture cycle that was published as The Fall of the Spirits of Darkness. And in there, he talks about the challenges as we move into the future. And he was given this lecture during World War I, the early stages of World War I believe. But he's making the point that seeing young people, and they have their truth, and with all the conviction, but none of the experience or the background to back it up. And that gets into that whole concept of the grandmothers again, is it possible to find truth that's going to have this capability to unfold? A truth that is morphic. It's not that the truth changes, but it's that its relationship to the world can change. And that's embraced by a concept that I got from my old friend David Spangler, is that misplaced concreteness he used to talk about. And that you can have something that's really very good, like you could have a glass of water, which is something that you absolutely need. You absolutely need water. But how good would it be if your friend, who I was just chatting with before we came on, came over and splashed you in the face with some while we're trying to do the show? I mean, I think it would be great, but I'm not asking him to do it. But the point is that you have to be able to make adjustments, but nonetheless, you have to be able to have a really wide net that you work with, I think. And that's what I've always tried to do. So consequently, I spent all those years creating databases, relational databases for esoteric studies. And then I did Egyptology and Mesopotamian studies database with all cross-reference on all the subject matter, with thousands of 15,000 plus volumes. And consequently, in digging beneath all of that, it just really reaffirmed my Christian convictions, that there's something inherently human about the Christian dispensation. And in fact, that's the whole point, isn't it? Is that Jesus Christ said, that he's come for all men, and women. He's here for everybody. He isn't just here for members of some club that are arguing over whether they're Trinitarian or not. Not that you shouldn't have your disagreements over the Trinitarian point of view or not. That kind of gets back to the eagle and child again, doesn't it?
Oh, I'm reeling with jealousy that you've met David Spangler. I really would love to meet David Spangler. You were mentioning Inklings and the bar. I'm sure none of them were strangers at getting to the bar. The Eagle and Child is very compelling as a place to go. Oh, images of God, John, images of God. We're too obsessed in the church nowadays with concepts of God as opposed to living the spirituality that God has given us. Images of God that I've come across in the Bible Belt. I know they don't like me anyway. As a nitpicking Latin master that's just trying to find fault with you all the time. Have you passed this exam? No, sorry, you're going to hell. That's not attractive at all. How can that be divine? Or, in certain feminists, no, I'm not anti-feminist. Yes, I've got feminist friends. Yes, I've read most of the seminal feminists. But you can't help thinking with some of them nowadays, it's sort of God as goddess and a gym mistress, who can outdo the men at any particular thing at any particular time. That can't be it either. This all-embracing totality, not this transcendent reality. And I'm not even saying there aren't, if that floats your boat, good. But I can't really see God as limited to those things. That's my issue there. I'm one of these weird Abrahamists. I think it's beginning to come into the open again because I'm beginning to get into trouble for it again. I started talking about it years ago and was practically savaged. But I just feel I need to talk about it again, so we'll see what happens. For me, there's too much linking Judaism, Islam, and Christianity for that to be ignored. Yes, we all have huge problems of understanding each other, and there are different texts and there are different interpretations. And I remember reading, I can't remember the author offhand, Kingston, God in One Person years ago, which was a Unitarian argument, which I really admired. It was beautifully put together. And I personally tend to resonate as some sort of Trinitarian. But, those are sort of internal family feuds, aren't they? And they're good, but let's not go too far with that because they're only internal family feuds. The minute we get outside that into what is Judaism saying about the very same text, the very same person, and the very same experience, and then we look at an Islamic interpretation of exactly the same story again, that's something I think that needs to be taken a lot more seriously than we're doing at present. I mean, the caricatures of Islam that I seem to be fighting against at the minute are absolutely unbelievable in Britain. I personally, right, so when I'm thinking of Islam, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of the gentle types of Islam that I've encountered in Central Asia, where, the older members of the family will always invite you to say Bismillah, prayers at the end of a meal. They welcome you, although you're a member of the family. They take you around all these wonderful places. If ever I'm in Central Asia, I'm always whisked away into a mosque as a clergyman. Have you seen this, Reverend? Have you seen that, Reverend? So if we look more at the sort of humane elements that bind us all, as opposed to the doctrinal elements, which in many ways were designed to separate people, I think that will do us all a great deal of good. And as I was saying a minute ago, we've got to be careful of images in all of those traditions. God as the nitpicking Latin master, God as chief rabbi, God as the Archbishop of Canterbury, God as the imam that just has far too much to say for himself. We've got to be careful that we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and we're missing the point of the entire Abrahamic tradition. For me, I've got this weird view. And everyone can shout at me and do whatever they want. I only think there's one religious stream in the world, and I think it's the Abrahamic stream. That's the only stream where I can actually start to grapple with the idea that something has been revealed. And it's not true that it's not in India. I mean, I noticed you mentioned the Agoras. I remember reading about those as an undergraduate and being genuinely horrified at some of the things I was reading. And I had an incredible Indologist, Friedhelm Hardy, may the angels rest him. He went to glory quite a few years ago now. Have you read this? And I was even more horrified than all the other stuff that he was putting in my direction. So, is that tradition there in Hinduism? Yes, the tradition of the Bhagavan. I didn't know what you were saying about the origins of the marketplace. I think that's very interesting. But, I think Shintoism, okay, that's cultural, that's magical, and I'm not saying it's bad, I'm not saying it's evil. I think it's wonderful and intriguing, but it's cultural. And if we're looking at Buddhism, surely at the end of the day, that's some sort of philosophy. That shows how high the human mind can fly. Isn't that wonderful? And if you're looking at, Native American traditions or all the rest of it, I think these great treasures of the human condition need to be embraced in the full. But for me personally, the Abrahamic tradition is humanity's spirituality at its most human and humane, but also more than that. It's God actually revealing the divine essence, the divine presence, divine realities to a world of contingent and limited beings. And that's what floats my boat, and that's what I get very excited about. I mean, certainly if I'm ever, say, in Azerbaijan, which I've been to very many times, it's the level of everyday decency and hospitality. I remember the last time I went, they were building a mosque, yet another mosque, on the outskirts of Azerbaijan. And the minute I'd never turn up in a collar just to be respectful, the minute they realized what my background was and what my calling was, I don't think I've talked to as many clergy in my entire life. Have another cup of, have another tea. Have another tea, Pastor. Have you seen this bit? I mean, let's not forget those wonderfully human and humanizing elements of faiths which surely are intimately linked at core. And now I'm waiting for the fatwa and the assassins to come and get me. You don't know where I live. John Barnwell does, but you don't. Ha 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 ha. Can't get me yet. Over to you, John.
Yeah, so you're not particularly worried about being chased by the minions of the old man of the mountain, the Hashashim. Yeah. Well, yeah. What I ultimately, for me, my approach in getting into understanding the various world religions, I tend to go towards what is the source waters of what they consider the paragon of their metaphysics. So consequently, if you get into Hinduism, it would be Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual Vedanta schools, generally considered quite exalted. And if you look into that, you'd see that it has a system that's very akin to the approach that's presented by Rudolf Steiner, and so consequently, you can decode things utilizing the Christian system of Rudolf Steiner. Or if you get into, say, Kashmir Shaivism, which is really the root source of Tibetan Buddhism in many respects. Gaudapada and Abhinavagupta would be your source waters for that stream. And it's interesting because Abhinavagupta, who just filled rooms with his writings, and yet hardly anything's been translated into English other than, Arthur Avalon did some translations of Tantra Loka and so on and so forth, and some commentaries. But you have that, and then you have the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is a methodology of meditation, basically, and the basic premise that meditations is the cessation of the modifications of the mind. Well, that to me is non-denominational answer to what is meditation. It doesn't matter what your denomination is. That's what you're attempting to do. That's as much like the quietism of Madame Guyon and Fenelon, So consequently, there is a harmonization, and likewise with Zen and Buddhism, the search for the quietude state of Zen Buddhism. And I frequently recount the story when I was in second grade, and we were taken to a Carthusian monastery, and they were teaching us how to write in script, and which they don't teach anymore. So maybe they do in Catholic schools, I don't know. But the public schools, they just teach black printing now. It's because I guess it doesn't hurt people's feelings. I don't know why they would stop teaching cursive, but they have. In any event, it's like a fragmentation of the language. You could see that the continuities, the sweeping fluid, water and air continuity, it's sunk down into the more materiality of writing like you're an engineer. And so that block printing style, which is interesting in and of itself, because that's a major cultural shift. Just that one little thing that I think has yet to be explored by anybody that I know of, but then I never really looked into it. But consequently, when you get into the tradition of Sufism within Islam is where you'll find some of the deepest of their teachings, and you get like Rumi. And in my mind, when Rumi talks about the rose, he means that's his representation of the Christ principle. Because if you look at its contextual relationship within his poetry, it's thematically embracing that whole idea of God is love and all of that. So that he's not a doctrinarian. He's not giving pronouncements on how you're supposed to punish people and all that kind of stuff. But probably the most widely acknowledged of the Islamic scholars, Sufis, is Ibn Arabi, Al-Andalus. And Ibn Arabi, it's interesting because if you study Ibn Arabi, you find that his first experience, his first metaphysical experience, was the appearance of Jesus Christ. And people don't know that. But then you look and you go into the Christology of the Quran, and it's very, very different from the New Testament. So that's a challenge, and I think that's something that can be met through dialogue rather than through wars, But that all depends on what cycle you're going through. And there tends to be wars and conflicts and all that kind of stuff when you're ending one of the great cycles and you're transitioning into another one. And so there's a turning of a page. And so then they have some kind of revolution. They start tearing down statues. They pull out the guillotine. And people tend to get into these conflicts. And of course, it's very short thinking. I think that leads them to think that that's the end game of what they're trying to pursue. But nonetheless, one of my distant ancestors was Roger de Bonville, who was beheaded at Antioch in the First Crusade. And so consequently, and it's interesting because way before I ever knew that, when I was into playing music, among the 3 songs we first recorded was one song called Crusade. And it was an actual historical account of the Crusade and all of that. And as I grew, I found that I had this profound affinity to Bernard of Clairvaux and the Cistercians. And Rudolf Steiner himself said, had he not gone to the Realschule, the technical school, and studied science and engineering and all of that, he would have become a Cistercian monk, of which Bernard of Clairvaux, although he wasn't the founder of it, he was the one who transformed it. There's great luminary figures within that movement, Stephen Harding, and it's just wonderful stuff. But so I have a great affinity for that, and I know that Dante did too, because in the Divine Comedy, when he's led by Beatrice or Beatrice through the various levels of heaven, when he finally gets to the highest levels, it's passed on to Bernard of Clairvaux, who takes him and shows him the Rose of Heaven.
Oh, John, I mean, this show is turning into a wonderful eulogy, a wonderful hymn on a Sunday afternoon. This is wonderful. Oh, wait, I mean, gosh, you've got me thinking, what was my high-raised fantasy is now ended, and like a wheel which ever moves but never jars, my will and wishes now by love impelled. That loves which moves the sun and all the stars. My apologies to Dante. That's as far as I can remember the closing verse. But I remember being completely uplifted and inspired by that many years ago. And the beauty of that book continues through the ages. Do you know, I was arguing with someone on Facebook earlier today who was talking about the Virgin Mary belonging to Saturday. What are the Saturnian links with Our Good Lady? And I said, well, maybe there aren't any. I mean, don't you think that might be polluting the idea of the Feast of Mary? And the guy replied, well, we all know Christ is the Son. And I found myself saying, well, no doubt. But, the whole point of the Abrahamic stream, the Abrahamic current, is there's something transcendent. And that's not said against paganisms. I love, in many ways, the neo-pagan community and what it represents. Its stand for ecology, its pro-life principles. I don't mean abortion. I mean the fact, biospheres, non-intensive farming, the very healthy attitude it's got to life and the quality of life. And I notice neo-paganism is doing the church's job, because the church seems to be doing an absolute appalling job on those issues. So, but they're the ones that actually say there are mighty powers, albeit celestial, in our experience. They're the moon, they're the stars, they're the sun. And I've no doubt of that. But my trouble with that is, isn't there anything above? Isn't there any hope? And of course, that's purgatory for Dante. They're all happy. The ancient pagan philosophers, they live a happy life, but he says very clearly, there's no hope in those spheres because hope comes with Christianity, by which I think he means the transcendent principle. And of course, that is what, for me, the Abrahamic tradition is all about, finding the transcendent principle within us and around us and pursuing it back to the source origin. Curiously, that came up a couple of years ago when I was talking about Chaucer, a remarkable man in all sorts of ways. I mean, he arguably prevented the English language from dying out. I mean, people have to remember that everybody spoke French. It was the language of the courts. It was the language of the court. If you wanted to do business in the marketplace, you did it in French. You didn't do it in English. And the inspiration for Chaucer appears to be that he could have recreated a language. He could recreate a language with vast poetic potential, and more power to his elbow, because that's exactly what he seems to have done. And of course, that very image is at the end of Canterbury Tales, where I can't remember which pilgrim it is. It might even be Pilgrim Chaucer himself. I can't remember. Is caught up to Olympus and he meets the gods and very clearly understands the gods are of this world. Are they the gods? Yes, they're the gods, but they're of this world. And he gets caught up into a transcendent heaven way above them, and then cannot bear the glory, the beauty of what he's seeing, and comes tumbling back to the earth. Now, somebody said to me, do you know, I'm trying desperately, John, to remember who it was. He got that from the Sufis. And I thought, what an incredible connection. What a wonderful idea. But I can't even remember who bloody said it to me, because I'd love another conversation with that scholar. And, that really needs pursuing, because you've got an Islamic impulse behind a Christian insight there. All very, very exciting. Oh, and I've got to say one thing about modern academia. And I know it's struggling very hard with underfunding. And I know everybody's got a political agenda. And I know you've got to be careful because nowadays you can lose tenure. And I know you're walking on eggshells all the time. Yada, 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 yada. All my friends in academia, hugs and kisses, hugs and kisses, hugs and kisses. I know. The point is, however, sometimes you do get things wrong. I was told by a Brazilian academic friend of mine a couple of years ago, why they're so angry about white culture taking over everything. I don't know what white culture is meant to mean. Why they're so angry is because when I was studying, none of the people outside the Anglo-American tradition were ever studied. You notice the finger pointing there. And all I could think of replying was, yes, I remember when we all read Ramanujan at university. And of course, the conversation finished there and then. Because we did. I'm sorry, we did. I remember reading him very clearly and thinking, oh my God, he doesn't know it, but he's some sort of anonymous Christian. I was on very, the all-powerful, all-knowing, loving presence. I felt really comfortable and at home. Oh, yeah. Truth, John, when you first came up with this theme for the show, I confess, how on earth can we keep that going over the weeks? But you've managed to do it. And of course, the minute we begin to unpack different parts of it, everything opens up into a much wider vista again. It's an exciting show to be involved with.
Well, it really includes everything, doesn't it? Except for untruth. And that's something we all stumble into, yes, isn't it? And so consequently, what can we do to refine our understanding through wisdom, so that we may have to go through a process of unlearning, right? Which is a challenge for some people because they establish a set of notions that during the course of their life has given them a zone of comfort. And so that it becomes their truth. And Rudolf Steiner had made mention of that at the end of one of the lectures within the cycle that I mentioned previously, this Fall of the Spirits of Darkness, about the young people extracting their understanding of truth from their immediate garden, and the conflicts that would arise from others who were doing the same, essentially the same thing, but yet the limitations of their perspective is what creates problems. And in getting into what we're going through in the current day, where there's basically like cancel culture going on, where they want to like eliminate certain cultural themes, as I said time and time and time again. Samuel Pepys's old adage, culture is that which remains after you've forgotten what you set out to do. And I mean, you could extend that, and you could add Andrew Breitbart's brilliant comment that politics is downstream from culture. So essentially, in looking at what's going on with the current state of affairs, it really is an attempt to give ascendancy to certain material culture, dialectical materialism. Let's call it what it is. And dialectical materialism is the basic founding philosophic viewpoint of the Soviet system. And you could say Maoism is a variation on that theme, that the whole idea that the iconography is the state, that's the central focus of all iconography is your allegiance to the state. And so you have what's going on with the iconoclasm that's running around trying to destroy statues, eliminate American culture and all that. Although that's a paid for program, nonetheless, it's out there, and it's kind of a really a red herring as far as people wondering why isn't something done about it. But when you have your apparatchiks in the blue areas, so to speak, that are permitting it, and in fact essentially supporting it, where you have policemen with stake trucks pulling up and dropping off stacks of bricks for the rioters. There's something methodically wrong. And so that you say, okay, well, if there's a method, then there must be a source of the method. And that methodology, it doesn't lead back to your socialist types so much in Britain, your Fabians. It can be rooted much more in the Trotskyites and the cultural Marxists of the Frankfurt School, of the mostly Jewish teachers, scholars that came over from the Goethe College, the Goethe Institute at the Frankfurt School in Frankfurt, Germany, because of the encroaching National Socialism that was going on, and they figured it wasn't a good idea to stick around, and they came to America. And so you have Theodor Adorno, and you have I don't want to go down the whole list, because at some point I think we'll do a show on that subject. But the cultural Marxism has to do with, there's a certain methodology. It's a methodology of deconstruction. And that's what we've been going through. And that's why I think the people that are of the Christian persuasion, they want to be at their guard, because you could very easily be sucked in. Like the statements you're saying, well, I don't know, I understand about, tearing down statues and all of that. No, you don't destroy history. And even though you might not like the statue, and they tore down the statues of all manner of people throughout the course of history. And there's a certain point at which that has a relevance, but that's generally something that usually occurs at the end of a war, and they go, "We won," and they go on and they tear down the other guys' icons, whatever. Their whole iconography is destroyed and all that. But that's not what we're doing here in America, is it? It's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be destroying America, or are we? And if we are destroying America, or they're attempting to destroy America, then it begs the question, then why are they here? There's plenty of places they can go do whatever it is they think's a good idea. They want to be communists, so they can go down to Venezuela and see how that works. But so consequently, people can get sympathetic because of some of the verbiage that progressives and socialists tend to use, that makes them think that there's something inherently Christian about socialism, and that could be seen easily because there's certain verities within Christianity that are truths, but when taken within the context of what a human being is today, not in the future, further in the future, people will have developed to the point, according to Rothsteiner, to where they will be able to be more concerned about other people than themselves. But at this stage of the game, in what he called the epic of the consciousness soul, or the spiritual soul, there's a certain isolationist aspect. There's certain fundamentally antisocial characteristics of the consciousness soul, because it involves the consolidation of an individual human ego, which is the youngest member of our organization, according to Rudolf Steiner. You have your physical body, and then you have your etheric body of life forces that you share with the plants, and then you have your body of movement, which was pointed out by Aristotle, right? The astral, and things that, like even a Venus flytrap, it's because of the penetration of the astral that the Venus flytrap actually can move. It has very rudimentary movement, but nonetheless, it does have movement. And then above that is the human kingdom, to where we have the human I am, that ego principle. That's the Christ principle that Rudolf Steiner points out. And when Christ says, I shall be with you, till the end of the earth, right? And he says, well, yes, but in what way is that the case? And so Rudolf Steiner gets into showing the development of culture through the ages, and how mankind has unfolded their what you might call meta-narrative, and to where it gets to the point, like some of the struggles that we have philosophically would be incomprehensible to the ancient Egyptians. They're still back in the picture language, and so a lot of the fine points of Kierkegaard, I think, would probably escape them. But nonetheless, when you get into trying to work with this, it becomes a clear concept of that there's a ring past knot when you get into materialism. And Rudolf Steiner said there's 12 fundamental philosophical perspectives, and that they all can offer something, whether it's materialism or pneumatism, or, and it goes through, I get into this in my book, my first one. Ultimately, but the Christ is the 13th. The Christ is beyond that. And in getting to what you're talking about with that whole idea in Dante, to where once he gets into the transcendental realm, it has to do with something that's specifically about the Christ, Jesus Christ. And that's singularity of the human realm. It's not this singularity of technology. That's like the absolute material counter image of that human singular I am that appeared to Moses in the burning bush, that was actually entered into the human realm in Jesus at the baptism, and ultimately through the resurrection was able to fully incorporate into the destiny of Earth evolution. That's my take on it.
Do you know, when you were mentioning cancel culture, the first thing that came to my mind was David Bowie, who must never be underrated as a talent and a performer. And I was thinking of a song he did years ago called Fashion, where one of the lines turns out to be, "It's loud and it's tasteless, and I've heard it before." So that's my attitude to cancel culture, I think. It's just old style iconoclasm, isn't it? There's nothing new. It's nothing new. Oh, John, you've said so many things there. Chuck Missler, the Bible Belt may not like me much, but I like certain people in the Bible Belt who, of course, also went to glory not too long ago. I remember him saying in one of his YouTube presentations, yes, I used to watch, I have a great admiration for Chuck Missler, Dr. Missler, that really his trouble, of course, his PhD, I believe, was in engineering, not theology. Therefore, he had quite a refreshing, practical attitude to things which are deeply spiritual. Sometimes even that's necessary. That his trouble with modern universities were basically they become a priesthood with defending a doctrine. And I was thinking about that for a while. I mean, what he was getting at was the irreplaceable doctrine of reductive materialism, which is now the standard of every type of discussion and every type of truth, every thesis which is presented to the modern academy. Therefore, in a sense, the ancient Greek pursuit of truth and goodness and beauty has really been thrown out the window, because what they've decided is that really that's the only standard they can work from, and everything must conform to that. Now, to my mind, to my horror, I mean, that cuts out so much of human experience. That cuts out so much of the qualitative aspects of consciousness, so many of the aesthetic theories, metaphysics is gone. You end up with something quite clear but deeply denuded. It's been whittled away. What you're searching for is whittled away. I mean, I suppose I was talking to my other half recently about modern research, and at a certain university in London, I won't mention names in case I ever get invited back for drinks, although I probably won't the minute I've said this. They were cock a hoop, as you say in this part of the world, a couple of years ago, because somebody done a PhD doctoral research on flip-flops, those sandals you wear during the summer. And they traced it back to a point of origin. And I was stood there thinking, what the hell are you all talking about? And it's something to do with international exploitation, the way they make these flip-flops. And I was stood there, I sat down, I was stood there initially thinking, but I know these people are being exploited. I don't need a PhD on flip-flops to tell me that. I don't need a book on the manufacturing of flip-flops. It's called economics. So I don't know. So yeah, I think sadly Chuck Missler was right, and I think we're looking at the enshrining of a theory, of an attitude, of an outlook on life, but it leaves out so much that needs discussing. I mean, you've also made me very aware. I've got to get back my copy of The Philosophy of Freedom, Rudolf Steiner's thesis, I believe, based on some of Goethe's insights, which I read years and years back. I had a wonderful hard copy. I don't know what happened to it. A lot of my books went missing through the years. Sometimes I'd lend them, and then the person would run off to Borneo. Or, sometimes they just went missing and they'd run off to Borneo anyway. So I need to get that one back, and I need to look at Rudolf Steiner much more deeply again. I was actually reconverted. I used to be a member of the Anthroposophical Society. I joined everything when I first moved to London. I thought, let's join all of it. It was great fun. I resonated most with the Anthroposophical Society. I couldn't work out why in those days. And curiously, it was a couple of years ago, they had a bookstore in the center of town, not near the spectacular building they've got near Baker Street, over near Baker Street, which is sort of Art Deco, sort of Art Deco. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful building. And I got talking to the old wise bookseller in this other part, this other outreach of the Steiner Society, who made me realize what great depth there was in all of that. All of those theories, all of those discussions. I must revisit it again. Bertie Russell, I knew Bertrand Russell, when he was very, very old and I was very, very young. Yes, I was young at one point. I had to say that on Facebook recently. Yes, I was young at one point. So there are two things I learned from Bertrand Russell, from the horse's mouth, as it were. He'd come from Quaker roots, of course, and I know for a fact, because he told me, he could see why people would want to become a Quaker. He could see that. He told me, therefore, he wasn't attacking spirituality. He was attacking the sort of institutional religiosity that leads to certain types of Christianity. And of course, the book, Why I'm Not a Christian, actually needs careful study. You know, it shouldn't be, I believe someone threw it on a bonfire in America recently. I don't think it needs that. I think it needs study. And also, oh, how do I put this? Also, the fact he felt, I'm going to get myself slaughtered here. The Hashashim of the old men of the mountains are coming after me, and also some fundamentalists are coming after me after I say this. You know, I mean, he in the History of Western Philosophy, which is a very great book, flawed in many ways, but a very great book. He actually compares Christianity to modern socialism. Actually, I believe he makes a figure or a diagram showing how the two equate, which has been taken far too seriously in British socialism. You know, the answer is yes and no. I mean, you know, when our Lord goes to glory and he promises the Comforter will be with us to the end of the age, and amen. I've absolutely no doubt of that. Amen. But you know, what is our good Lord actually getting at? Because what turns up is the community of righteousness, the initial communities based around the teachings of Christ Jesus himself, which of course saw themselves as ultimately communities of virtue. And they're living strangely egalitarian. I made the mistake once and once only of saying socialist. It was meant to be shorthand, but I realized never ever to do that in Christian company again, or I will be lynched. You know, radically egalitarian communities that literally did share everything and were pioneering new sorts of human interaction and human exchange. All incredibly exciting and important stuff, which doesn't necessarily necessitate any type of socialism as it's known currently, and promises something beyond the restrictions of our current human condition. I mean, I doff my cap to you, John. You've reminded me. You know, what is a pastor always trying to do? Push people into evolution. You know, you can be nice, you can be decent. Why not try it for a while? You never know, you might like it. You know, but we've also got to remember all the checks and balances of the evolutionary process. And, you know, maybe just let each other off the hook a bit more. You know, maybe just be a bit more decent and a bit more caring and a bit more loving. I'm passing the baton back to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, I always go back to the idea the Lord is your shepherd, okay? And, you know, the shepherd has this dog, and the dog, he runs around the herd and he barks, right? He doesn't jump in there and start biting the sheep, like, get in line, you know? So it's not a really a militant thing. It's this kind of organic thing that the herds, now it's going over here, and there's usually like a lead sheep or goat, depending on what you're shepherding, but there's a pecking order in the sheep, and they tend to go wherever that character leads the herd. And it's a challenge, because then you're getting into the herd mentality thing, the egregore, the group. What is the group mind, and we think. Well, there's not a we that thinks that's necessarily wholesome, but there is this whole thing of the brotherhood and sisterhood in Christ. That's really what it's about. And breaking bread with others. Do this in memory of me, so that the image of the Eucharist is really central to Christianity, especially like within the Christian community that was founded by Rudolf Steiner, although he was helping them found it because they asked him. It wasn't really his personal path, but that's a whole nother story that we've approached previously. Interesting you bring up David Bowie. Yeah, I used to get free tickets and passes from David Bowie's band when they came to Detroit. A very good friend of mine was the drummer in the band, Dennis Davis, who was also the drummer for Stevie Wonder for more than 15 years or so. Dennis is probably the best drummer I ever jammed with, I mean, or even knowing, I mean, at the very top is like him and Steve Gadd. Of course, I never jammed with Steve Gadd, but I got to smoke cigars with him on a leisurely afternoon when he came to town with Eric Clapton. But Bowie's he's a little dicey. He was into Aleister Crowley, and I spent many years trying to divert people out of the thalamic stream, which eventually, if you stick around long enough, there's like this hook. And before you know it, you're pulled into something that, like Raymond Bernard, the Dutch banker, ran into. And there's some horrifying endgames that can occur. Although I've known very many people that were into Crowley and have no idea of any of that and never heard of that, and they just like to read him. But Crowley was a great rebellion against Christianity. There's no question about it. He even took it upon himself to make himself self-named the Great Beast. But one of the people that comes to mind with me, and again it ties into you because you're so intimate with theater, was an individual named Del Close, who was a friend of mine. He's one of the founders of Second City in Chicago, which is the really comedy central for the comedy cast of characters that have arisen from Saturday Night Live, and all your Eddie Murphys and that whole crew, John Belushi and all of them. And but Del was very much into Aleister Crowley. He used to teach theater here in Detroit at Lycée International, which is an acting school. And he would always, I'd go and I'd get to sit next to him while he teach the class. And so I got quite an education in theater. He would buy books for me. I didn't have something he gave me on the bicameral brain and lesions in the brain and the effect on neurology that I have over here somewhere. It has a signature on it. He gave it to me. And so you see that there is this undertow. It's a very real thing. And that whole Sabbatean antinomial stream of Crowleyanity that has become so pervasive among the elites, and that's the stuff that's cropping up with this whole thing with the NXIVM cult and with Jeffrey Epstein and all of the over-permissive society, shall we say, Prince Andrew, and that character that was convicted of his abuses, that was a friend of Prince Charles. You could go into the palace anytime you wanted and walk right past the guards. So there is that whole shadowy thing, and so I tend not to move towards trying to apologize for that stream. If those people want to do it, that's their thing. I bet you, though, I know more about it than they do. And consequently, I've known a lot of the leading people. One of my old friends, he did Enochian stained glass for Israel Regardi, who was the secretary of Aleister Crowley. So I have a very intimate connection with a lot of that. I've known a lot of, like, the principal biographer today is he bought the Blue Equinox from me, and he's like one of the principal biographers of Crowley. So I know a lot about it, and all I could say to people is good luck with that. If you think that that's going to take you to the rose of heaven, I think you might be surprised, because it ties more into Dante's Inferno, shall we say. And Dante is a very interesting character because he's got the three different stages. There's the purgatorio, the purgatory, and the heaven aspect of it. But he also has the Inferno, and it's interesting to note who he sticks down there. And by the way, it's going under a repression, because one of the people that didn't fare so well in Dante's worldview was Muhammad, right? And but it's interesting to note, though, that German officers, it was required reading for German officers all the way up to the First World War. And so it's very much a part of the cultural landscape of Europe. It's very much important. And consequently, when you get into trying to understand, I have a work here somewhere. I was peeking around trying to see if I saw it. I never know what we're going to talk about, so I don't always have the books at hand. But it was Gabriele Rossetti who was the father of the Pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriele Rossetti. And Gabriele Rossetti wrote the anti-papal spirit of Dante. He wrote a whole wonderful study of Dante, and showing, again, there was this struggle between the church and between the forces of the nobility, and the struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and all of that. That's the backstory for Dante. You have to understand Dante, and you have to understand his cultural milieu in which he worked. But nonetheless, it's lasting because there are universal points made within Dante that can still help people understand how to approach the world today. And so consequently, it's a value. So I guess that's a big thrust of what David and I have been doing here, is to reaffirm the value of culture. Is it? What is truth? And when you say, going back to that quote, culture is that which remains after you've forgotten what you set out to do. The culture is like a residue of human activity. It's not something that's like, okay, we're going to make it like this. And if you get into, like, for example, William Irwin Thompson, a good friend of David Spangler's, and he wrote a book called The Americanization of Nature. And basically the thrust of the book is that this modernist stream is attempting to make the world resemble Epcot Center down in Florida, which is like Disneyland, right? Which is interesting because it's true in more ways than one, because really Disney was very, very closely tied to the aerospace technologists and all of that. So consequently, every time there was a new development in photographic or engineering aspects of it, it was Disney Studios that got it. The first dibs on a lot of stuff that came out of government black science projects, even, So it's really kind of unusual, because if you get in, and if you get into studying theater in the U.S., there's two fundamental streams of esotericism that are floated, that are well, there's three, because there's the witches of Mount Tamalpais over near San Francisco. You can't forget about them. But there's the Crowleyan stream, which ties into Second City in Chicago, and also Jack Parsons with his founding of the rocket laboratory. They did a film, I guess, now that's available on one of the channels about Jack Parsons, who has a crater named after him on the moon, and he was an associate of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. But the other school in acting is these Rudolf Steiner's works, and that's the Christian side of the equation. And you have people like Marilyn Monroe and Jack Palance and all of these people that have studied in the acting school of Michael Chekhov, and it used to be on the landing page of the Michael Chekhov Academy. I haven't checked lately where it is, but the lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave on acting. And we mustn't forget that the Goetheanum was a theater, right? The Center for the Anthroposophical Society in Dornach, Switzerland, and now they have the second Goetheanum, because the first one that was made all out of wood with tongue and grooves and pegs. And I mean, it's really just one of the phenomenon of the 20th century, was burned down by a fundamentalist, actually a mentally retarded boy, or mentally handicapped, I guess is the word they use today, who was inspired by the rantings of a preacher, a local preacher. And so that the narrowness of that perspective triggered the mentally handicapped boy to burn down the Goetheanum on New Year's Eve. And so, of course, soon after, with the insurance money, they built a new Goetheanum out of poured concrete. But nonetheless, theater is a big deal, and that the cultural sphere is central. Politics is downstream from culture. And that's why you're seeing such an attack on Christian culture and on American culture by these quasi George Soros type movements, is because they want to debase Christianity, they want to debase culture, they want to turn this into what they envision, that they feel that the Soviets failed at, because they tried to do it politically. They posited Theodore Adorno and those characters, that the challenge wasn't political, it was cultural. But in order to do it, you have to have a cultural revolution. You have to nullification of culture, cancel culture, right? That whole impulse that's now coming out of the students at the universities. Why? Because they went to the university and that's what they were taught. They weren't taught how to think. They were taught what to think. And so it's dicey at best. But speaking of culture, we're getting near the end here. And so I'd like to remind you all that we are authors, David and I both. And so I have David's here somewhere, or maybe you have it somewhere. But I'll mention my books while he looks for his. Here's my first book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel. The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the esoteric Christianity that flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. That's available on eBay. Don't go elsewhere, because you might end up paying a premium on somebody who's pretending that it's not available, but it is available from me. And also the sequel, which is right here, The Arcana of Light on the Path, which is more of a meditative tool. And they're both available on eBay. And David, you want to say something about your book, or one of your books?
Yeah, I mean, Jenny have made me very aware I've got to start doing more theatre again next year. And when I get sent lots of scripts and I get sent lots of ideas, but mostly I find them rather dull. And with me, there always tends to be a tendency to do sacred theatre, or at least explore issues that have a metaphysical dimension to them. But you've made me very aware it's time to get off my proverbial and hit the boards again next year, which leads me into my first two collections of poetry, Caliban's Redemption and The Grammar of Witchcraft, which are explorations of the esoteric and Shakespearean noir, as some people have called it, and through the eyes and the thank you, my friend. I can't believe you got that. Thank you, my friend. Through the eyes of Caliban, an incredibly complex, malevolent dwarf. So I was looking at that magical world through him at that point. My newest book, Mount Athos Inside Me, with an incredible cover by my dear friend, the artist Haralempia Roschakov, is actually a celebration and study of poetry, literature, painting, theatre, art generally, creativity, and the inner world. You know, those things manifest in the outer world as well as the inner world. And therefore, other things, the religious journey, the religious quest, tends to be, I think, for genuinely religious seekers, an internal experience, which we need churches for, so we can offer each other checks and balances and make sure we're all going in the right direction together. But, you know, ultimately they're internal, they're sacred, and they're God-given, they're angelic. So I was trying to look at all of those things in one book, and I think people will enjoy it. So that's for me this week, John.
Well, other than that, if people want to be generous enough to donate, buy us a cup of coffee, what have you, I have my www.paypal.me/John Barnwell 888, and David has his paypal.me/DPARRY 777. And so if you feel so moved to buy us a cup of coffee or something to that effect, that would be greatly appreciated in helping us with our researches, seeking out the volumes that pertain to what we're working on here. But David, I just want to thank you. Another delightful episode in our morphological journey here into what is truth. And I look forward. Oh, by the way, next week is going to be on a Saturday, and so consequently, don't look for us next Sunday, but at the same time next Saturday.
For one week. For 1 week.
For 1 week, yeah. He has, because he had a previous commitment, and I highly endorse him keeping up his commitments. And so consequently, it's a greatest pleasure that I sign off here. But before we do, David, could you lead us in a little prayer?
Oh, Holy Christ Jesus, you lead us into ever greater self-understanding through beauty, through goodness, through truth. Allow us to stand against the modern superficiality of endless doctrinal confusion and all of those powers and portents from toxic and poisonous places that would enslave us. May each of us know the truth, and may that truth set us free. Amen.
Amen. Well, good day, sir.
Take care, my friend.